Well, good afternoon. It's so nice to be with you again. My name is Dr. Dan Simon. I'm the Chief Clinical and Scientific Officer of University Hospitals and the President of Cleveland Medical Center. I'm joined with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Salata, the Physician-in-Chief of University Hospitals, the Steris Chair of Excellence in Medicine, and the Medical Director of the Roe Green Travel Center and Travel Medicine and Global Health Center. So Bob, it's great to be with you again today. I'm returning just off a trip to see many of our friends down in Florida, and have been spending a lot of time over the weekend getting up to date on just a lot of news related to COVID. We thought maybe this would be winding down, and instead it seems to be heating up a little bit. So let me go through a little quick status update. We'll get your comments on how things are going, and then we'll open this up for questions, which I think are going to be quite extensive today. So I'm going to share and get right into statistics here, because I think everybody wants to know where are we, and right now, where exactly are we going? Well, as you can see here, we are certainly off the third surge, but what we're seeing right now across the United States is an increase in cases, about 5% over the last 14 days, and an 11% increase in hospitalizations. I think the scary figure is that in the past 7 days, the globe has seen 5.2 million cases, which is the highest 7-day period ever. And we've now passed 3 million deaths. The countries of greatest concern now remain India and Brazil. Well, what about Ohio? Ohio is also seeing an increase in cases, 11% over the last 14 days, a 40% increase in deaths, and a 28% increase overall in hospitalizations. And I think that it's also mirrored, as you know, by an increase in cases at our own medical system, with about a 24% increase over the last 7 days. We nadired in the low 30s, and yesterday and this morning have 92 patients across the health system, with the academic medical center now at 26 patients, 74 overall on the floor, and over 18 in our intensive care unit. Well, what happens if we look across the country? What's happening? And what's very interesting from the standpoint of Ohio is that the Midwest is on fire. In Michigan, really the worst state in the country, with greater than 250 cases per 100,000. Remember back when Governor DeWine said he would start relaxing when we were below 10 cases per 100,000. So Michigan is on fire. Minnesota is really heating up. So it's really the upper Midwest, and you see Illinois having spots of a lot of trouble. So Ohio right now, okay, but a lot of concerns that the effects of loosening social distancing, masking, coming inside for events, people coming back from spring break, could also affect Ohio down the line. Well, let's see, where are we now in terms of vaccination statistics? Let me just jump to that really quickly, and we'll get to our map of the U.S. So the good news is we keep advancing. The dark green is now over 42% of residents with at least one shot. If you look at the United States as a whole, 40% of the population have had one shot, 25% are fully vaccinated. And Ohio is just, again, right smack dab in the middle, 38% with one shot and about 26% fully vaccinated. We're doing pretty good on average vaccination doses per day. Remember, we want to exceed that 3 million mark. We're coming in at about 3.19 million over the last 7 days. And that hits us with herd immunity in the 70 to, as they say here, 78% range, somewhere between June 17 and July 2nd. this is an important number to keep in mind. We'll refer back to this, I think, just a little bit later. And I think with that, Bob, we can stop sharing for now and ask you. So vaccination is advancing. Michigan is on fire. Ohio cases are going up, and even our own health system has seen a threefold increase in hospitalization in the last 2 to 3 weeks. What's going on?
So there remains fatigue related to the pandemic. The spring break for both families and younger folks remains another nidus for the new surges. And we have not yet won the race between vaccination and the cases, including the fact that the major variant in the United States right now is the UK variant, now accounting for almost 45% of all newly diagnosed cases. We do have the capability, and the Biden administration has provided more funding to track very carefully the emergence of variants. We'll get back to that later when we talk about new studies of the mRNA vaccines, looking at boosters or new generation vaccines as well. The one good thing is if you look at our own data in the system, almost all of the cases that we've seen have been in folks either partially vaccinated or not vaccinated at all. And we're seeing younger age groups even being hospitalized. And I think that's an important message here in the 20 to 50-year-old age groups. The deaths, fortunately, have lagged behind. They often do. But if you really look at the data more closely, those over or at the age of 65 are dying less frequently. And I think that's a direct reflection of the vaccine campaign to get more and more people vaccinated. But we have seen individuals in the 70s and 80s admitted to our own system who have not been vaccinated as yet. So I think that's a telling point and another point of education that we need to bring to bear. That all said, we need to continue our diligent efforts to vaccinate more and more of the population. As we'll discuss later, however, the J&J vaccine halt or pause, I think, is fed into the vaccine hesitancy issues and given them more leverage and firepower, if you will. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Terrific, Bob. So, we have a lot of questions that have been sent in, and I think, we'll try to go through them in sort of an orderly fashion here. But the one that seems to be most popular right now is the fact that a lot of people are vaccinated and they're uncertain exactly of how to interact with others. So let's start with the easy scenario, which is that Marcy and I want to come over and have dinner with you and your lovely wife, and we're all vaccinated. So can we have dinner, and do we need to be masked when there are just 4 of us all vaccinated?
Yeah, so just ahead of answering that question, Dan, there have been over 5,000 cases of breakthrough COVID despite full vaccination that's being investigated by the CDC right now. And when you look at it in detail, that represents a rate which is high. It's much lower than what we saw in the clinical trials, and that is 0.08%. So that's important to know that in real life, like we saw in Israel, the amount of protection that one receives from getting fully vaccinated really is important and does speak to these statistics. I think in the case that you painted, I would love to have dinner with Marcy, especially. Haven't seen her for a while. But I think if everyone's been vaccinated and not in really high vulnerable risk groups, it's fine, I think, to have those kinds of gatherings. The state is still pushing for indoor gatherings to be, restricted, but outdoors, at least the governor has said, there's much less restriction that we should apply at this point in time, given what we just talked about. So I think it's great to have dinner. When do you want to come over?
So the tougher question, I guess, though, is let's say it's a family gathering and there are 10 people there, 9 are vaccinated. Let's call it 2 family groups, but 1 individual is not. That seems to be the more common scenario. Often the younger individuals who are not vaccinated. How do we handle that? Social distancing and masking, even if you're vaccinated, who should mask and who shouldn't?
Well, certainly those that have not been vaccinated should follow those same precautions. And this will apply more and more to the younger folks, as you pointed out, including the children. But let's keep in mind, again, the statistics. Most children, if they do acquire infection, have relatively mild infection, et cetera. So I think one other gauge to apply here is whether or not any of the individuals in those 10 person setting is particularly vulnerable, especially the older, those with underlying diseases. We've talked about those before. And in addition, they should be asymptomatic at the time of visitation. But I think applying social distancing, physical distancing, and also masking and hand hygiene, et cetera, is still important in that scenario for those that are not vaccinated yet.
Great. So Bob, the question of I guess of all that we get every day, that complicated one about variants, booster shots, duration. So let's start with the easy question first, which is we have heard that the vaccine is highly protective at 6 months largely from the clinical trial populations and now some real world data.
Right.
Could you please clarify? It's not that the immunity disappears at 6 months, it's that we don't have data beyond 6 months. So tell us about what we know about where we are now and then what trials you're in to determine whether or not we need boosters.
Yeah. So it is true, your statement about the duration of protection so far at 6 months. That's as far as we've gotten. But in both Moderna and Pfizer, which we're undertaking further studies here, which I'll mention, we are following those individuals out for 26 months after the second vaccine. So more data will be forthcoming. The next planned data release will probably be at the year point, et cetera. In the meanwhile, both Moderna and Pfizer are undertaking new studies. We just completed our enrollment in giving a booster of the original vaccine. Given that the variants are in play, we think, based upon real life experience, again, related to the UK variant, which, as I mentioned before, now constitutes almost 45% of new cases in the US, and whatnot, including laboratory studies where they've taken blood from vaccinated individuals to Pfizer and Moderna, primarily in the clinical trials, and derived the antibodies that developed as a result of the vaccination, exposed those antibodies to the variants, both the UK, Brazil, South African, et cetera. And they found that all of these variants are neutralized, except that the South African variant is not as well neutralized as the UK variant, for instance. But they feel that the level of antibodies that are developed from the original vaccination are still sufficient to protect. The new studies are, as I mentioned, both Moderna and Pfizer looking at giving a booster approximately 3 to 6 months after initial vaccination, and to look at the immune response to see if it is as expected to be more robust and longer lasting, and that will be followed out. At the same time, both Pfizer and Moderna are studying younger age groups down to the age of 2, starting with younger pediatric patients, up to the fact that they just finished their studies into 12 from the 12 to 15-year-olds and found that there was 100% efficacy, as well as side effects that were typically observed in the older adult studies. So they are in the process. Pfizer is the first to be has solicited the FDA for approval for that new age group between 12 and 15, and therefore on and on. In addition, Pfizer, during the same study I mentioned about boosters, we also vaccinated, along with 42 other sites in the world, individuals who have not been vaccinated to date, but they were given a new generation vaccine that really is aimed at the South African variant, which we already mentioned. It is, we think it is likely that that vaccine will provide coverage for all the variants, including the original strains of the virus, and will be cross-protected in that regard. So we'll look at that, and whether or not we'll need boosters in the future is part of the question that they're asking now. It's been stated recently by the CEO of Pfizer that probably will need boosters anywhere from 6 to 12 months after being fully vaccinated. But we don't have the answers yet. But there is some reassurance in terms of the real world data and the laboratory-based data to suggest that that we're protected. And given the fact that in the US, the dominant new strain circulating is the UK variant, and that the amount of breakthrough infection in those that were fully vaccinated is very low, 0.08% again. I think that's very reassuring at this point. We've got more work to do, and this will not end in terms of other groups they want to study, like the immune compromised folks. There was a recent study out of Johns Hopkins using both Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine that after a single dose, remember that is around 80% protection in non-immune compromised individuals, it was only 17% of folks who had undergone, for instance, transplantation. We will have new information forthcoming about after they're fully vaccinated, what that means. And this will also, I think, inform guidelines about approaching that group in the future. But we have much more to learn. We don't know everything yet. And in that regard, that's where things stand at this point.
And so I think, just for some of you who have just coming in, we believe that 12 to 15-year-olds will likely start getting vaccinated in the June, July timeframe. Certainly middle school and high school should all be vaccinated before the fall school year. I think the younger kids, as we've talked about and learned from Dr. Fauci this weekend, probably the younger kids, we're talking about the first months of 2022. It's unlikely to be sooner that those trials will be complete. Yeah. Well, Bob, there are a fair number of questions about still this issue of if I had COVID, do I need a vaccine? And I know we've talked about this before. You and I have a pretty strong feeling about this, but you're the expert here. So tell us about when you would be vaccinated after you had COVID.
So it used to be the case that the CDC originally suggested waiting at least 90 days before undertaking vaccination in those that had previous COVID infection. They've really loosened their criteria now. We've been applying this from the get-go at UH, and that is as long as one has recovered from initial illness with resolution of things like fever, cough, shortness of breath, but may have some lingering issues related to taste and smell, among other things. And we can get into the long hauler issue later. But as long as that occurs, and the timeline generally is 10 days, and then waiting an additional 2 weeks, then you can start vaccination at that point. Several folks have warned that the side effect profile from getting vaccinated after having COVID in the past is heightened, and so one should be prepared for that. There's only one country right now, and that is France, that is suggesting only one dose of the messenger RNA vaccines to be given in the context of having COVID before, because it does appear that there's such a robust increased immune response that may be sufficient. Right now, that's not the posture in the United States, although there are several new studies that are emerging that probably will inform that decision. But that's very important because there are cases of reinfection, if you will. And I think with that in mind, because in some individuals, based upon your symptoms with COVID, when you've had infection, the antibody response, if your symptoms were mild initially, wane by about 3 months or so. Whether they'd pick back up, if you will, and being re-exposed is uncertain. But given those cases of reinfection, the emergence of the variants, et cetera, which are even more contagious in general, I think we solidly recommend that people who have had COVID before go on to be vaccinated as well.
Great. So Bob, one of the big questions of the day is Johnson & Johnson and the issue of blood clotting, which is unusual because it's called vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. We have heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, which can cause both bleeding and clotting in unusual places, both veins and arteries, and obviously in the case of the post J&J, some clotting in the veins in the brain, which has been very problematic. So tell us a little bit about J&J, what you think will happen. I know they're going to reconvene supposedly on April 23rd for a recommendation.
Right. So the first time the advisory committee to the Centers for Disease Control decided to continue the halt until more information emerged. And the issue started first with another adenovirus related vaccine, that is the AstraZeneca vaccine, where now 23 cases have been reported in the literature with probably a similar pathogenic profile. There is, as part of the immune response to the vaccine, the development of the PF4 antibody, it's called, which we see in folks occasionally who are on heparin for a variety of reasons in the hospital setting or even in the outpatient setting. And it has been associated with similar presentations in the past. There have been a few deaths, including one after the J&J vaccine. There have been 6 well-confirmed cases so far, but recently over the weekend, a case in a young male was also reported. It's remarkable that most of this has occurred in women to date between the ages of 18 and 48, although in the AstraZeneca situation, an individual who was a woman who was 73 developed a similar complication. Exactly how this occurs is not really known, except that in response to the vaccine and the immune response, this particular antibody develops, and it participates both in lowering the platelet count, but also in these in clotting problems. And so, as you mentioned, unusual sites, cerebral, sinuses, and we have those in the brain, which heretofore have been, seen with clots in the context of infection more than this phenomenon, not necessarily with COVID per se, but in other types of infection, and also lowering of the platelet count. But that's the other marker, biologic marker that we can look for. But it usually occurs anywhere from 6 to 18 days after the vaccine is administered. And the head problem could be manifested by headache, dizziness, visual problems, and there can be abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting associated with abdominal clots. And obviously, where we usually see clots in most other individuals, in the legs and in the lungs, with pulmonary embolus have been seen too. Keep in mind that COVID itself can be associated with clotting abnormalities, but this seems to be very special, but it's very rare still. 6 cases out of 32 million vaccinated folks with J&J so far. And it's 100 times more likely if a woman's on birth control pills to develop clots as opposed to post-vaccine. So we'll see what happens with regard to whether or not it's released. There may be some recommendations to only vaccinate certain age groups where we'd be beyond the usual age groups that are at risk. The same thing has happened with regard to the AstraZeneca vaccine in several countries. And because of this phenomena of clotting and low platelets, some countries like Denmark and other places have now stopped entirely the AstraZeneca vaccination campaign in those individual countries right now. So more to come. Given that they're both adenovirus associated vaccines, one has wondered whether or not that has something to do with initiation of this unusual immune response, which is called vaccine-associated immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia. It's really a mouthful, but that was named by a German investigator who noticed this first and has published on this already.
Well, that's terrific, Bob. I think that, one of the things we always have to highlight is the real difficulty in understanding what's, caused by the vaccine, what's caused by other disease. We have, maybe 500,000 plus heart attacks a year, another similar number of strokes, and then several 100,000 deep vein thromboses and PEs. And they happen in these populations when you're vaccinating millions of people. And the question is, are they related? It's interesting that the rate of clots associated with COVID is estimated to be over 39 per million, and the rate with vaccine much less than 1 per million. So we know that getting COVID itself puts you at a much higher risk for blood clots. And so this is a difficult area. I'm glad that, the NIH and the CDC and FDA will be convening on this to try to come up with a reasonable recommendation. I think the good news for our listeners and viewers is that we have not seen the same clotting complications with Pfizer or Moderna. And that's obviously one of the concerns of these agencies when you do have a potential alternative. So Bob, let's for a moment shift gears to a really difficult area, and that's that of vaccine hesitancy. I'm going to show a slide which is a little bit sobering, and this was put together by the CDC and is looking at the federal government estimates of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. That means those individuals who are not so interested in having a vaccine. If you do wide surveys right now across the United States, about 65 to 70% of individuals are willing to undergo vaccination. But as you can see here, it's not homogeneous across the country. There are very strong geographic regions, mostly the Northwest and the Southeast, and some of Alaska, that have some hesitancy to vaccination. And interestingly, I've pulled this slide from Our World in data from the WHO, looking at a share of survey respondents who agree with the statement that if the vaccine was made available to me this week, I would definitely get it. And interestingly, the United Kingdom leads the way with nearly 68% of individuals saying I'll get a vaccine. But go look at the United States, where if the vaccine was available to me this week, only 42.8% in this survey said they would actually go and get the vaccine. And we've learned just this week in a news survey that if you interview those under 35 years of age, 36% say they have no interest in getting a vaccine. I mean, that's 4 out of 10. And that starts to impact, Bob, our ability to achieve herd immunity if 40% of individuals less than 35 don't have an interest in the vaccine, since they're the ones who are out and about, especially in situations of entertainment and others, where they're potentially, getting variants and then going to visit parents and grandparents. So tell us a little bit about your view on vaccine hesitancy and how that potentially could impact my estimates of herd immunity by the end of June.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, Dan, about this and the concern that emanates from that. And it's the younger people that are more hesitant if you look at the statistics. It's also interesting if you look at blue and red states, that there's a correlation with the red states having more hesitancy than the blue states as well. And it's more often the case that higher income, higher educated the higher educated population is more vaccine hesitant, in part stemming from several things that we've already discussed. One is fatigue about the pandemic. Secondly, the fact that they think they're not as vulnerable. But really, and if you look at the rates with regard to the new cases, especially the variants, they're affecting the younger, that is 20 to 40-year-olds more so than any other group right now. So we have to really change our approach and education about this more so than we have before. And I think part of it stems from the fact that they think of this really like a flu illness. I'll be down for a couple days and that'll be it. So I think their sense of invulnerability plays into this as well. But they have an obligation and responsibility, in my view, with regard to their risk of transmitting this, as you already pointed out, to more vulnerable individuals. And I think that we have to keep emphasizing this. It's a little bit concerning, especially after the J&J halt, that the numbers of open slots, appointments for vaccination at Cleveland State and elsewhere really has grown enormously because people wanted to, be one and done. I think that plays into this as well. The anti-vaxxers are really playing hard on the J&J issue with regard to side effects and why no one should receive any vaccine, including this one. So I think it's a mixture of all of those things, but it's really going to take, concerted effort to provide even more education, get through the J&J halt, and see where we end up in terms of our recommendation. Obviously, given what's happened with J&J, this will also affect AstraZeneca and the decisions when they present their data to the FDA as well. And I just was speaking to colleagues in Uganda this morning, my study coordinator who's been with me since the late 90s. And she said they're just starting to vaccinate there, but it's all AstraZeneca, even though the cloud remains about what would be available. That is because this is the AstraZeneca vaccine and J&J, because of storage situations and costs, were really felt to be more the global vaccines that we would utilize, and we need to keep that in mind.
Great. So Bob, let's shift gears just for a second and talk a little bit about this concept of the COVID long hauler, as it's known. Could you tell our viewers what exactly is a COVID long hauler? What is the definition of someone for how long symptoms have to persist to have that? And do we know exactly what it is and what can we do about it?
So that's a great question. And the strict definition of a, quote, long hauler at this time, although I don't like that term, it's been renamed by Fauci as the post-COVID syndrome, that this occurs in up to 30% of individuals in some way, shape, and form, and up to 12 weeks or longer after they've had COVID-19 documented. And it consists of a variety of complaints, including brain fog, including lingering headaches, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea, vomiting sometimes, rheumatologic complaints with regard to joint pain and other muscle aching, and on and on. And the mental health component of this is enormous. So It's of interest that so far, and this is all case series and anecdotal, that if individuals go on to be vaccinated, despite lingering symptoms like this, that about a third of them, and in one series up to 40%, had magically had their symptoms disappear. And it's been speculated that improving the immune response, both antibody and particularly T-cell responses, may get at the last reservoirs of virus. Not that we can demonstrate active viral infection going on, but parts of the virus, if you will, in certain sanctuaries in the body that helps to eliminate that, and so on and so forth. We, among many institutions, are starting a long hauler clinic. We're calling it post-COVID recovery clinic. This has been really pushed forward and championed by David Rosenberg, who is one of our community-based pulmonary specialists. And it will be, by intent, a multidisciplinary approach. And we've already had several organizational meetings about this, where we can screen patients initially, get them to the right subspecialist as their symptoms mandate, and have also important collaborations among the consultants as well. There will undoubtedly be other protocols, trials that will come about. We want to use this as a basis for that. Grace McComsey, who is involved in our clinical research operations, will be involved in this from the get-go with a database and also biorepository of specimens that we can really study more carefully in those that do not or do have lingering symptoms. So I think stay tuned, because this will come about probably by May and will really be, again, I think, an important part of the process, given so many people have lingering symptoms. That is not to say that if somebody 4 to 6 weeks out has significant symptoms, we're going to want to hear from them and refer them accordingly. But I think the strict definition is 12 weeks or more out. We're using 6 to 8 weeks kind of as the basis for getting people enrolled. We want to be consistent with other major institutions across the country, so all of this information can be collated. But that's a very important and emerging issue.
I think, Bob, one of the things that's important to highlight, and it's come up sort of in one of the questions, which is the frustration around changing guidelines, definitions, recommendations. And I think, what it really highlights is that we don't have all the answers. Right. And our own Dr. Fauci, Bob Salata, and others rely on science, and that's data. And the most robust data obviously comes from randomized clinical trials. And, these vaccines were developed carefully and deliberately and leveraged technology, mRNA technology, for instance, that had been available for many, many years. But it is true that vaccine development was rapid. And I think that what we're doing is we're learning as we gather more data. So we know, for instance, one of the questions that came up was about variants and the Pfizer vaccine. Well, we know from Israel, where 80% of the infections were from the UK variant, post approval and going in, that the vaccine is at least 90% protective in that scenario. So we learned that because everybody, for instance, in that country is in a nationalized health system. We have all the data, and that was all turned over to Pfizer as part of their agreement. So we are learning as we go along. And I think the same is going to apply in the post-COVID syndrome or long hauler. I mean, we all have friends who've lost taste and smell with COVID, and some of them regain their taste and smell in weeks. But I know some who have not fully regained it at 3 and 4 months. So it really suggests some sort of ongoing inflammation, in the taste and smell neurons or something else. So, stay tuned as we learn more about this. Well, Bob, one of the other questions that come up is a good one, is you and I have talked a lot about the focus on vaccination and in some regard on monoclonal antibodies, which is sort of a surrogate for vaccination in a way, but not a lot of attention on antivirals. So can you, question here is, can you update us what's happening with COVID treatments? Are there any new antivirals on the horizon?
So the answer is yes, it's being studied. Grace McComsey, who I mentioned before, is leading a new oral antiviral study here at UH, which is meant to be given earlier in the course of disease, much like Tamiflu is given for influenza. And so that is starting to randomize or get folks accrued to that study now. We'll have more information. But I've said this before, but I think the area of therapeutics in COVID has lagged behind the vaccine development in many ways, given the emphasis and the focus on vaccination as a preventative. And that was rightful in many ways, but I think we need to turn back because there are many individuals that are, given the current epidemiology and surge, 25 states have increased rates of COVID again at this point. So one of the approaches has been monoclonal antibodies, as you mentioned. One of the things that I look back on is first the use of so-called convalescent plasma from individuals who had COVID, recovered, their blood is taken, and it's the plasma component is then reinfused with all the appropriate safeguards being done into other individuals. And it was only a very small subset of individuals, older folks especially, that derived benefit from the convalescent plasma. And these, in retrospect, had very high levels of the antibodies against COVID. And so that, to me, was a possible indication that monoclonal antibodies, which you could make in great abundance and is much easier to administer, et cetera, than is convalescent plasma, really was the solution. And there are two companies right now, Eli Lilly and Regeneron, remembering for many of you that former President Trump received the Regeneron cocktail. And those did really help in terms of preventing progression of disease. The Eli Lilly product, which was a single monoclonal antibody recently, the approval for that alone was now stopped, and it's now combined with the second one that is a cocktail again, which seems to be helpful. And with a single antibody, that seemed to be less effective than against some of the variants. That all said, there are now studies from nursing homes related to residents there who are not COVID infected, as well as the caregivers, and more recently in family settings, where it was just reported during a meeting in March nationally that administering monoclonal antibody, especially to those that are most vulnerable for not only developing infection, but then progression of disease, was effective in terms of a preventative strategy. So we haven't reached that point yet, but I think we'll get there as we are developing true antivirals, as you asked at the very beginning. So we do have some strategies. And there are some other things, such as the use of inhaled steroids recently for patients that are with COVID, that seem to also ameliorate that very aggressive immune response and are beneficial as well. So we're going to see a few more things come about. The standards for care right now in patients with COVID early on would be the monoclonal antibody infusions, although there's an age limit related to the studies that were done. And we usually reserve that for individuals 65 years of age or older, and now down to 55 if they have underlying conditions that place them at risk for progression of disease. Beyond that, we have remdesivir, which is still in play, especially if combined with medications like steroids given systemically, one called dexamethasone or decadron, that really can have an impact. And that study was done, again, by colleagues in the UK, but that's become standard of care. We need to have oral antivirals. We need to see where it would be reasonable to administer infusions of monoclonal antibodies, even from a preventative standpoint, but that's where we stand right now.
Yeah, and I think it's important for all of our friends to know that UH is leading the way. The Harrington Discovery Institute had a call for national proposals, and also in the UK for novel COVID antivirals and vaccines for the next pandemic. We've screened over 300 applications, funded 12, and 4 of those actually right now miraculously are in clinical trial that fast. One of the leading ones was featured in the New York Times, which is an inhaled intranasal spray that has antiviral properties against COVID for up to 24 hours. It was 100% protective of COVID infection in a ferret model, and that was published in the leading journal in the world called Science. That's obviously, these are investigators from Columbia and New York that are partnering with the Harrington Discovery Institute, and that will be soon coming to clinical trial as well. So imagine that, an inhaled spray, refrigerator only, kills virus for 24 hours. That would be a great thing, Bob, for you and me when we hop on that plane to go back to Uganda again, to make sure that we're very protected on that journey. So, stay tuned for that. Well, we are running out of time, and I want to give Bob, you the opportunity here for a few closing comments. People want to know what they should be doing now until they hear us again in 4 weeks. So what's your recommendation?
So it still remains a race between vaccinating a sufficient number of individuals and the emergence of new cases, including the variants. And I think we want to win out on the vaccine side. And I think for those that were very keen to get the J&J vaccine, and we'll see what happens with AstraZeneca in the near future, we just have to play this out. There have been some that have publicly said that this was a mistake by the CDC to halt the vaccine, but who wants to take a chance, in my opinion, with a young woman right now with these devastating clots and so on and so forth. So I think I err on the CDC and FDA side right now. We'll get more information to inform the further decisions in that regard. And I think, as Dan pointed out before, we're still learning every single day almost about not only vaccination, but the virus itself and some of the newer side effects that have come about. One other that was just reported out of Israel again, you may have seen this, Dan, is reactivation of shingles after vaccination, and whether or not, and somehow that modifies the immune response so that one is at risk for reactivation. It's been seen in a few number of individuals, but I think it's a new phenomenon that we're just starting to see.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to gather with you again. Just when we think the numbers are going down and we're on our way for everything to be routine, we're hitting this. I'd say the impact in the hospital now is that we've roared back with folks who have delayed the care of chronic health conditions. So the hospital is very, very busy. Cleveland Medical Center, our 1,000-bed academic medical center, has an occupancy today of approaching 98%. And so having 28 COVID patients here is putting a challenge on us to be able to make sure that we can do everything, which of course we will. And that is the advantage of a great health system. As we say, we can load balance and distribute and make sure that patients are treated in the right place at the right time and for the right condition. And so we're going to keep, marching forward. We are hopeful that our terrific leadership with Governor DeWine and our Ohio Department of Health will continue to guide us. We understand the frustrations of some of our listeners related to changing guidelines. and we understand how difficult that can be. But we are hopeful that Bob and I are bringing you good news, at least up-to-date news about what's happening, and trying to give you the facts as we say. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you're going to see this in the recorded version, we hope you enjoy that as well. And we will look forward to seeing you again soon. So be well and be safe. See you soon.
Thank you.